The lights went out in Britain in 1974, not from war, but from a political tantrum. The Prime Minister's attempt to govern by logic had collided with the chaos of the real world, setting the stage for a national crisis. For 20 years, following the Second World War, the illusion had held. Britain, though exhausted, was still a great global power, but by the late 1960s, the reality was inescapable. The sun had set almost completely on the empire, a vast retreat of status that should have caused a political and economic shockwave. Yet, the transformation happened with an eerie, almost voluntary silence. There were no mass riots, no national reckoning. Instead, there was a quiet, insidious sense of diminished prestige, a feeling that the country was smaller, colder, and increasingly irrelevant on the world stage. This change coincided with a traumatic economic shift. Britain, the very first industrial nation, was now becoming the first to de-industrialize. Factories were closing. Thousands of jobs in core industries were vanishing. Unemployment was creeping up, and far more ominously, inflation was becoming an uncontrollable menace. This economic backdrop created a climate of instability, a desperate need for a firm hand to modernize the nation, to cut through the inherited decay and usher in a sleek, efficient new era. The electorate, already disappointed by the promises of Harold Wilson's Labour government, turned in 1970 to a new kind of conservative leader, Edward Heath. Heath was not from the old guard. Born in 1916, the son of a master carpenter and a lady's maid, he was an anomaly leading the party of the landed aristocracy. He was a technocrat, a man who believed every problem, no matter how complex or human, could be solved by the right committee, the perfect plan, and a set of meticulously calculated numbers. He saw the nation as a flawed machine that simply needed a brilliant engineer to fix it. This belief led him to build a perfect economic system, an unbreakable cage of policy that would eventually trap and break the nation. This belief fueled the great crusade of his career, to drag Britain, once and for all, into the European common market. For Heath, this was more than economics. It was a moral commitment, forged by his memories of the wars and trials of the 1930s and 1940s. Europe was the solution, the ultimate committee where nations could hammer out a civilized, prosperous future. But Heath had a fundamental disastrous flaw that would eventually shatter his premiership. He was spectacularly rude, famously solitary, and socially tone-deaf. He was a man who hated small talk, a leader who viewed many of his own party members as little more than irritations, calling them shits, bloody shits, and shits. He was the spoiled prodigy who had learned to command respect, but never affection. He became a yachtsman, a pianist, adopting the mannerisms of a beau patrician, but beneath the adopted accent and the committee mindset, he never quite grasped the messiness of people, the chaotic, emotional, and often irrational element of politics itself. And this fundamental social blindness would lead him, inadvertently, to challenge the single most powerful organized force in Britain, a force he had already been beaten by once. This flaw brought him face to face with the one institution in Britain built entirely on organized collective emotion, the trade unions. For years, the unions had served as the unwritten fourth estate of the British state, boasting over 13 million members. They were fragmented, over 1,000 smaller unions, all competing. But in key sectors, they held a power that could bring the nation to a shuddering stop. The coal miners were at the apex of this power. In 1972, the National Union of Mine Workers had gone on strike, choking power stations of fuel supplies and forcing Heath to give in to their demands. It was a humiliating defeat, a warning that the technocrat had not heeded. Following that first loss, and in a desperate attempt to curb inflation without resorting to politically unpalatable mass unemployment, Heath doubled down on the very thing that the unions despised: income policies. These were government-mandated limits on how much workers could earn. It was the ultimate technocratic solution: centralized, controlling, and utterly inflexible. By late 1973, he had ushered in the third complex phase of this plan, known simply as Stage 3. It limited pay increases to 7% a year, but it contained a critical, hidden time bomb: threshold payments. This was a sweetener, a clause that promised pay would rise automatically if inflation passed a certain level. Heath and his economic experts were confident this safety valve would never be triggered. They believed they had created a perfect, rational, and unbreakable system. In the midst of this rising tension, we ask you, the viewer, to pause. If you are finding this breakdown of Britain's near collapse fascinating, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us dive deep into the world-shaping moments of history that reveal how fragile power truly is. But as the autumn of 1973 approached, this perfect system was about to collide with a series of shocks that no committee, no technocrat, and certainly no amount of Stage 3 planning could ever have prepared for. The oil sheiks were about to set the bomb. The world, as Prime Minister Edward Heath would discover, was not a computer. It did not respond to logical input or perfectly calibrated plans. It was chaotic, violent, and utterly unforgiving. In October 1973, as Heath was trying to hammer out a rational compromise with the coal miners, a distant, brutal conflict ignited the fuse beneath his entire economic strategy. The Yom Kippur War exploded when Egypt and Syria launched a stunning surprise attack on Israel. The war raged for 10 brutal days, and the Western powers, particularly the United States, were heavily involved in airlifting supplies to Israel. To punish this involvement, the OPEC oil producers, the Arab nations, announced an immediate, catastrophic 70% increase in the price of oil. This was the unstoppable force that shattered the fragile mechanism of Stage 3. It was a financial tsunami that injected inflation into the British economy as if the entire country had been awarded a 20% pay rise overnight. The oil crisis immediately triggered the Stage 3 time bomb. The threshold payments kicked in not once, not twice, but 11 times in the next 3 months, pouring ever more inflation into the system and proving Heath's entire economic model was based on a fundamental miscalculation. Simultaneously, the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, seeing their pay fall behind rapidly, were ready to strike. The union's leadership, led by the craggy Lancastrian Joe Gormley, demanded a massive 35% pay increase. They had a powerful, morally resonant case. Their members were risking their lives every day in the pits, and their pay had fallen far behind other workers. Why should they accept a 7% limit when the price of fuel they couldn't control was skyrocketing? But the price of coal would become irrelevant. A crisis, half a world away, was about to hand the miners a weapon that no British government could withstand. This time, the miners had the perfect, terrible weapon. The oil crisis meant the government could no longer rely on cheap, imported oil for its power stations. The government needed coal, and the miners could cut off the supplies, effectively plunging Britain into darkness. At the end of October, the National Union of Mine Workers called for industrial action, beginning with an overtime ban that drastically cut coal production. The government responded with visible panic. For the 5th time in 3 years, a state of emergency was declared. Petrol ration cards were printed, public lighting was cut, and the Bank of England was forced to announce a massive credit squeeze, tanking the economy, which had already been overstimulated by Anthony Barber's ill-fated dash for growth. Adding to this climate of fear was the increasing violence from the parallel crisis in Northern Ireland. As Christmas approached, the Irish Republican Army launched its bombing campaign on the British mainland. 7 days before the holiday, car bombs ripped through London, injuring 60 people and layering an additional sense of existential dread onto the economic crisis. The entire atmosphere was summarized in a single, deeply humiliating international anecdote. From Uganda, the infamous dictator Idi Amin, an officer in the former British colonial army, announced the launch of a Save Britain Fund. Amin stated he was moved by the plight of the British people, offering 10,000 Ugandan shillings from his own savings and dispatching a lorry load of vegetables to the airport for shipment. The British Foreign Office, utterly humiliated, was forced to ignore his cables and telegrams to the Queen. To many at home, this was the ultimate emblematic reminder of how low Britain's international prestige had fallen. Heath was trapped. He could not run cars on coal, but he could not afford to pay the Arabs for oil while refusing to pay the British miners for coal. He faced a perfect crisis, and his technocratic instincts were telling him only one thing: hold the line. On December 12, 1973, the crisis reached its terrible climax. Heath's Chancellor, Anthony Barber, looking haggard and defeated, sent a report to his cabinet colleagues that laid bare the reality. Britain faced the gravest economic crisis since the end of the war. The country was broke, the currency was collapsing, and they had no fuel. That afternoon, the cabinet met and made the most drastic decision of the post-war era. They would enforce a 3-day working week. Starting at midnight on New Year's Eve, industry, shops, and offices were permitted to use electricity only on 3 consecutive days per week. Street lighting was cut by 50%. The use of floodlights in sport was banned, a measure so extreme it would eventually change the way the country watched football. Television broadcasts were ordered to cease at 10:30 at night, plunging homes into darkness. The Prime Minister himself stood up in the House of Commons and then gave a broadcast to the nation. It was one of the most depressing moments in British broadcasting history, as Heath announced, with palpable exhaustion. We shall have a harder Christmas than we've known since the war. As the 3-day week kicked in, the reality of the crisis was matched by the rapid mental breakdown of the men attempting to manage it. Sir William Armstrong, the head of the civil service and Heath's closest technocratic ally, began holding secret, hysterical meetings where he locked colleagues in a room and warned of communist infiltration within the government. At one point, he reportedly addressed civil servants while lying on the floor, lecturing them on sex and the Bible. It was a sign that the relentless pressure was cracking the very foundation of the bureaucratic state. The madness at the heart of Westminster was a symptom of an impossible choice. But when a powerful union leader offered Heath a lifeline, the Prime Minister refused it, a decision driven not by strategy, but by pride. Yet, as the lights dimmed, the crisis produced a strange, unexpected paradox. The public, shivering but not freezing thanks to an unseasonably warm winter, didn't respond with the national unity Heath had anticipated. The power cuts were scheduled and predictable, not random or spontaneous. People found ways to cope, gathering around candles and rediscovering board, games. There was even a psychologist who publicly advised couples to use the downtime to experiment in their sex lives. The result was not outrage at the miners, but mounting irritation at the government. Heath's rigidity made things worse. On January 9th, the Trades Union Congress, TUC, came to meet him. Their new General Secretary, Len Murray, was a formidable, intelligent man who had worked his way up from poverty to New College, Oxford. Murray offered a lifeline: give the miners what they wanted, and the TUC would issue a statement guaranteeing it would be treated as a special case, preventing other unions from exploiting the deal. It was a pragmatic opportunity to win back control, to cut the Gordian knot. But Heath refused. He saw Murray's offer not as a strategic truce, but as a grubby, undignified deal. He believed that as a man of principle, he must stick to his guns. His personal rigidity was amplified by his pride. He could not grasp the political necessity of flexibility. As one Scottish miners' leader, Mick McGahey, bluntly told the Prime Minister, the only thing he wanted was to see the end of your government. Heath, the strategist, was left without an answer. The man who had sought to lead a nation of consensus had become a man of stubborn isolation. The refusal of the TUC peace treaty was the moment the general lost control of the war. On January 24, 1974, the miners made their final, terrible move. They announced an all-out strike to begin in early February, guaranteeing that coal supplies would be completely cut off. The announcement landed on Westminster consumed by paranoia and exhaustion. Heath's younger advisors, the so-called Young Turks like Nigel Lawson, saw only one path left: an election. They argued that the Prime Minister must go to the country and ask the voters directly to choose between the elected government and the union bosses. This was the moment for a bare-knuckle fight. Heath, exhausted and miserable, finally cracked. He was not a man built for improvisation, and having run out of logical options, he reached for the ultimate democratic tool. He decided to call an election. The timing, however, was another disastrous miscalculation. Heath should have held the election earlier, when the shock of the 3-day week was fresh. Instead, he lost his nerve, delayed, and then called the election on February 7th for a vote on the 28th of February. He was not only late, but he was calling the election on the very day the National Union of Mine Workers strike was set to begin, a move that seemed to confirm the union's power, not challenge it. His central question to the nation, who governs Britain, was now a loaded gun pointed directly at his own head. The election became a massive national referendum on a single dramatic question, repeated ceaselessly by Heath to the voters. Who governs Britain? The elected government, or a particularly powerful group of workers? But Heath completely misjudged the national mood. He expected the traditional British consensus to rally around the flag and the sanctity of Parliament. He expected people to blame the workers for the hardship. Instead, the public was fed up with the inconvenience, the disruption, and the sheer incompetence of the man who had promised to modernize and had only delivered austerity and darkness. The brilliant, ruthless cinematic contrast of the campaign was that the government was asking a philosophical question while the opposition was addressing a practical one. Harold Wilson, the intuitive Labour leader who had been waiting in the wings, campaigned on the promise that he could simply do a deal with the miners and turn the lights back on. He offered a grubby, immediate solution over Heath's rigid, technocratic principle. The public's anger was visceral and personal. The actor Kenneth Williams wrote in his famous diary about his fellow train passengers who were complaining not about the miners, but about the government. He quoted one person saying the 3-day week was all rubbish and the miners should be paid. The mood had turned. The strategist had forgotten the people. Heath's entire political philosophy, that a rational plan, logically applied, would produce a rational outcome, was being refuted by the unpredictable chaos of the British voter. He was making his final stand against the dark forces of history. But his opponent was not the miners. It was the public's own weariness and irritation. He was fighting a war of principle, while the country just wanted the lights to come back on. The final day arrived in a climate of tension and uncertainty. Edward Heath, the man who had dedicated his life to solving national problems with ruthless, detached logic, was waiting for the answer to the single defining question of his career. When the votes were counted on February 28, 1974, the result was neither the clear mandate Heath had craved, nor the definitive Labour majority that Wilson had hoped for. The answer from the British people was a hung parliament. No single party had a majority, but the message was unmistakable, and it was devastatingly personal. The public's answer to "Who governs Britain?" was unequivocally, "Not you, Heath." The Conservative Party had lost their majority, and the great technocrat's career was over. After a brief, chaotic attempt to form a coalition, Harold Wilson and the Labour Party returned to power. The tragedy of Edward Heath was complete. As historians would later confirm, he had been incredibly unlucky, facing the oil crisis, the Irish Republican Army bombing campaign, and the sheer inflationary pressure of global commodity prices, all at once. But his bad luck was only the amplifier of his fatal flaw, his personal rigidity. He was defeated by his own inability to compromise, his failure to grasp the emotional needs of his countrymen, and his refusal to make a grubby deal when it was the only thing that could have saved his premiership. He was a brilliant strategist who simply forgot to factor people into his calculations. The true legacy of 1974, however, was not the fall of Heath or the return of Wilson. It was the collapse of the post-war consensus. The year proved beyond all doubt that the old methods, the reliance on powerful trade unions, the technocratic interventionism, the pursuit of a managed economy, were broken beyond repair. The idea of one-nation Toryism, where government, business, and Labour could all sit together in a committee room and find a solution, was dead. This chaos was the great prerequisite for the political revolution that was coming. The failure of the system in 1974 created a vacuum, a desperate need for a new kind of hardline leadership that would not seek consensus, but confrontation. The stage had been cleared for the rise of Margaret Thatcher. That desperate dark winter remains a powerful story of how fragile stability truly is. It was a crisis that did not end with the fall of a government, but with a fundamental, existential shift in the way Britain saw itself and the world. It was the year a mature democracy came face to face with its own mortality, and in doing so, it didn't just lay the groundwork for a harsh, decisive new future. It permanently redefined the rules of power in modern Britain. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the political chaos that shaped modern Britain, leave a comment below telling us which year in political history you think was even worse. This siege on the British state may be over, but the conflict it ignited continues to define the nation to this day. Hit the like button and share this video with a history buff who needs to hear this story. If you want to see more stories about the incredible events that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to our channel and engage with our community. History isn't always made by the largest armies, but sometimes by the biggest economic shocks.